Live streaming is on.
Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is January 14th, 2022. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on Clinton Ignatoff's great podcast, Concerned Medicine. Thank you, Clinton. I hope you join us again as we close out. And a big thanks to Henry Jenkins for being here today. Henry, where are you calling in from?
Downtown Los Angeles.
Well, how cool. I'm in Venice, so we're close. The first question, Henry, is what's the best thing for a human being?
The best thing for a human being is other human beings. I think we're social beings. I think we're living in a period of social isolation, which has not been good for us. And the connections we form with each other is what keeps us sane.
Dude, that was great. There's no right or wrong answers to any of these questions, but right off the bat, you got the first question absolutely right. I got that question from a Wilhelm Reich student, but you should hear what I get. So there's a lot of fun answers. One of my favorites was pizza.
Well, it has something going for it as an answer.
Henry, what's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
Well, it's going to sound pandering, but I think podcasting right now is giving me the broadest range of information because it's so open to diverse voices and perspectives. I think so much the news, we know what it's going to say before they open their mouth, depending on which cable network we're watching. And I think our news apps filter what we see or hear. We're in filter bubbles on Facebook and Twitter, but I can listen to a podcast from a totally different perspective than my own and seek it out and try to absorb something from someone else's point of view.
Thanks for being so articulate. I appreciate that. Why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Well, I think it's, again, part of the herd mentality. One thing that we use information for is to start conversations with each other. We're hunters and gatherers of everything, but information is one of those things. We also want to understand the world we're living in better, to anticipate dangers, to seek out pleasures, to engage in meaningful gift giving behavior to other human beings. And information serves all of those purposes for us. So I really am a great believer in the kinds of communities we form through in and around information and the practices we develop for using information for social exchange.
Beautiful. And Henry, I think you've answered this, but is this need or want to collect information more innate or more invented?
Ooh, we get into the nitty gritty area. As a social and cultural studies person, I tend to believe there are very few things that are totally innate. I think biology matters, but biology is what connects us to other animals, other species. And what separates us from them is our culture. So I would say, insofar as humans seek out information, and as far as we know, information exchange doesn't play the same role in the life of any other species, I have to assume it's to some degree cultural. The problem is that if we look around the world, it's hard to find any culture that doesn't place a value on information. But there can be cultures that place less value on new information than others, that want to remain in a constant world, hold on to the past, carry it with them, find reassurance that the world is unchanging. And there are others that seek out information to anticipate change, to promote change. And I think those are very different relationships to the kinds of information we gather and exchange as human beings.
Wow. Do thoughts create emotions?
Yes, and emotions create thought, right? I mean, there's no clear separation between emotion and thought. Thought is embodied, it's shaped by our emotions. We seek out things that satisfy us, we push back on things that horrify us, we are repulsed by some things, and that constrains what information we can absorb. but it also may target us to drill deep into something that no one else would have noticed, and to call that to the attention of a larger public.
Wow, and you really get this because the innate invented, you did sort of lean, and well, it's both and it depends. So this is another one. Is thinking no, excuse me, let's interject this. Uh, your observations of humans, are they more feeling beings or more thinking beings?
Oh, again, I think these are so interwoven. I'm not sure I can do anything but hold the middle line. But I think
Yeah.
in moments in time historically, we may veer toward one side or the other. Right now, we are in a very reactive frame of mind as a society. I think we are feeling intense things, and it often overrides rational thought, including the desire for self preservation. I think in some cases, if you're not wearing a mask because you want to, and not getting vaccinated because you're trying to prove a political point or assert a political identity, I think we are pushing emotion above and beyond any rational sense of self preservation. And I think segments of our society are doing that right now,
Yeah.
including Supreme Court justices, apparently.
Hello. And it's interesting because 80 to 90% of people, when I ask that question, go, I think we're more feeling beings. So they use the think word and then they say we're more feeling.
Yes, yes.
It's and one friend actually even says, we're in a group, he'll go, I feel we're more thinking beings. It's very rare when people say we're more thinking beings. But of course, we're both. You can't separate them. But since we invented words, we can. Again, we'll get out of these soon. But is thinking more innate or more invented?
Well, I think the capacity to think is innate. I think what we think about is cultural. How's
Yeah.
that as a way of splitting the difference? Obviously, as human beings didn't have the capacity to think, we wouldn't think. But once we think, what we think about, what we imagine happening to the world, comes out of our culture in a pretty deep way.
And when you say cultural, what's another word for the layperson to understand what you mean when you say cultural? Or
Well,
another word, or just suss it out a little.
yeah, so for us, for someone in cultural studies, culture is not simply the best that man has produced, a la Matthew Arnold, but rather culture is ordinary. It's the everyday life we live. It's the way we collectively respond to the materials around us. So culture is as much an ashtray as it is an artwork, right? It's all of those choices we make about what we value, what we think is important, how we relate to other people. All of that for me is culture.
Beautiful. Robert Williams, the underground comic who became sort of highbrow in museums, said, if it matches the couch, it's art. If it demands attention, it's culture.
See, I almost go the other way around, right? That art does demand our attention a great deal of time. It's not decorative, but it is a way necessarily, it could be, but it is a way of demanding that we pay attention to something. Whereas the ashtray, to continue my example before, sits there. It's usually not particularly decorative. It may or may not match the couch, but it tells us that we live in a culture where dropping ashes on the furniture is considered antisocial. But smoking is allowed as a cultural practice, right? That, and then from there we can go out. But the ashtray is already telling us certain things about how we live and what we value that I think are worth analyzing and reflecting on.
Yeah, it really evokes McLuhan naming one of his book, Culture is Our Business, because he knew what he learned from James Joyce of Finnegan's Wake, that we can have epiphanies in everydayness.
Yes.
And
And the
so,
objects we hold on to and we carry with us become significant because we touched them and are touched by them, right? So
yeah,
everyday objects become part of what makes us human. Or when we do workshops to get groups of people talking about the future together. And we find that having them bring a memory object that says something about who they are and where they came from allows us to pay respect to cultural tradition, even as we're encouraging them to think in progressive ways about the future. So the ashtray could have been given to me by my father-in-law, who smoked like a smokestack, and it has his smell on it at that point. In a very basic level, it's a talisman of who he was. And even though I don't smoke, maybe this ashtray is something that I hold on to remember someone that mattered to me more than its function. And so, yes, these objects matter at fairly deep levels.
Beautiful. Henry, fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I
think until I have a conversation with someone else. I'm a very collaborative person. I've written a lot of pieces dialogically. I've written a lot of pieces in collaboration. I like to surround myself with thinking partners, and I talk through ideas over and over and over before I put them down on the page. And so for me, I don't know what I think until I'm engaged in a conversation, would be a fair way of summing it up.
really well. It really resonates my thinking too. Chomsky says language is not, well, no, I skipped that. I'm sorry. Can humans think without language?
That's interesting. I mean, think I think the best research suggests no, that we need words to attach to things before we can create memories, since our heads are full of words that cue us to memories. There certainly are pictorial ways of representing things that I can see and understand, but I think the theories that of mind that I value most start with an idea of an internal monologue where we are making sense of the world and narrating it to ourselves. And so when we look at pictures, we're putting words around them to understand what it is we look at. Um, that would be my theory. Uh, I'm far from certain in it because it's not my field, but it's where I believe the world to work.
Beautiful. Thank you, Henry. Chomsky says a language is not just words, it's culture, tradition, unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do when language doesn't work, when it breaks down?
Well, that's where we have. I think those are some of the most interesting moments for someone who, say, I do ethnography, looking at online communities, fan communities, and so forth. The moments that are most interesting to me are when things break down and the culture has to explain to itself the different assumptions that led to the breakdown of language, right? So you have to articulate, you go meta at that point. If you're in the middle of a flame war and you want to diffuse it, you have to pull down the first assumptions, find that common ground, work your way out from there until you understand the cultural agreements which make it possible for the community to operate. And then you can understand the disagreements that still have to be worked through and resolved. And so I think the moments when language is not transparent, when it fails us, are rich opportunities to go to first principles and build the community from that point up.
Two Alan Turing questions from 1950. Is thinking a function of the soul?
Well, we have to decide if we believe there is a soul. I do. So, yes, I think thinking is a function of the soul. My capacity to think is at the core of what makes me a human being, what makes me a distinctive human being. And therefore, that is as close to the soul as I can get, or my thoughts, my words, my expressions.
Can machines think?
Oh, there are days that I think they think. Machines. Another way to put that are machines with a mind of their own, which is a long trope in American humor. I used to say that effective computing was the more frustrated I get, the less likely the computer was to work. It is responsive to my level of frustration. It seems on some bad days, but no. So far, I have not met a machine that thinks in the ways that humans think. They may process information, they don't comprehend information.
Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
I'm not sure I know how to separate the two out. What is meaningless happiness? To me, happiness comes when I've made meaning of my environment and I feel like what I'm doing, the choices I'm making are meaningful choices. So I'm not sure that I can isolate one of those things from the other.
Yeah, I got the question sort of through Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He says meaning lasts and happiness doesn't necessarily last.
Well, that's fair. You can consume a meaning, and in doing so, consume the emotions that surround it.
Yeah.
And a meaning can become mundane, taken for granted, and it may no longer spark joy, to use a expression that's got a certain circulation at the moment. So hold each idea in your hand, and if it sparks joy, keep it, and if it doesn't, toss it out. Maria Kondo might tell us
Like
if she was more philosophical. Yes.
Like who tells us?
Maria Kondo, she is one of the gurus on stuff and disposing. She has a minimalist aesthetic, and she tells people in her television show, take each piece of each item in your apartment and hold it in your hand. If it sparks joy, keep it. If it doesn't, get rid of it, regardless of its value. And so I was just sort of taking a Marie Kondo twist on ideas.
Us book collectors have problems there. Okay, so does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Is consciousness there bubbling away and we're detecting it, more detecting it, or are we more creating it?
Huh. That's another interesting one. I mean, off the top of my head, and no pun intended, I would say that consciousness is how the brain functions. So therefore, consciousness is embedded in the brain, but it's ongoing, and so I'm not sure. It's a chicken egg problem at that point.
Right.
I don't know enough about the origin of consciousness in a bicameral or other cameral kinds of mind to know the answer to that question at any deeper level than to say the brain works through its relation to consciousness.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it because you get it. I'm after hunches. People often go, "Well, I'm not a neuroscientist." I was like, "Well, you don't have to be. Just what's your hunch?" Like Lily Tomlin says it well. She goes, "Reality is just a collective hunch."
Fair enough, and I'm willing to play the game of hunches, but there are certain areas that above my pay grade. I'll say that.
Right. Hey, you haven't said that. I remember this guy at USC, big hotshot Hollywood director. I asked him one of these questions, and he says that's beyond my pay grade. Then later in the discussion, he came back around. So it's still big. What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
I would say speed of thought, although we can't always process our thoughts as fast as they come at us.
Yeah.
I think there are any moments when you're talking and you can't keep track of your own thoughts because they're zinging at you from every possible direction, and that suggests an enormous speed with which thoughts can hit us.
That's why I take notes, but I appreciate what you just said. Audre Lorde, the poet, said you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rainer said you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest? I mean, you already mentioned podcasts, so let's say besides podcasts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've written about new media literacies and the kinds of skills we need to navigate this new media environment. And there's a number of them, some of which are classic skills like the capacity to play, perform. Remix is an important skill at the current moment, especially for breaking down the master's tools and the master's house both, right? That we've got to deconstruct things and put them back together and on our terms. And I think that's very important. At the moment, I think transmedia navigation is really important. That is the ability to recognize representations that may occur on different media platforms and connect that information together. And that's a skill set I need if I'm trying to watch one of the Marvel movies. And it's a skill set I need if I'm trying to work through the complex statements about truth surrounding COVID, say, right? I need to be able to take information from many different channels, understand the relationships between them. And I think that's a really vital skill at the current time. I think negotiation is an underrated skill or tool. The ability to meet someone whose worldview is different from your own and to try to work through those differences to find common ground and achieve a shared goal, I think is a skill that's maybe most undervalued at the current time. So I think of all of those as tools, tools of thought that are important for how we make sense of the environment around us.
Really well put, Henry. This is a joy and a pleasure. I'm sure learned a lot. And what new toy do you suggest?
Oh, I mean, I think everyone should have a new toy as often as possible. I'm a great believer in play. I try to think about what is the toy that we should possess at the current time. I think we need toys that we can play with other people for whom we totally disagree and break down that disagreement so we can see each other as common human beings. And then toys that get us talking and reflecting. Now, I don't know what that is, but I think that's the kind of toy we need, that we need to play together in the way that two kids who are total strangers can meet on the playground, and most of the differences between them are not significant, right? And so that they find that common laughter, the common pleasure of play before anything else. As adults, we don't give ourselves permission to play, and as a result, we reside in opposing camps so often that we don't find common humanity through laughter and playfulness. And that's exactly what we're going to need to do if we're going to move beyond the crisis of the current moment.
That was really good. It really brought back a memory way back in my head. It's Gail Zappa, Frank's wife, and Jim Morrison were kids in a sandbox together, and she hit Jim over the head with a hammer. So it's misusing that toy. Sorry. Maybe it helped him become a lizard. Who knows? Henry, what do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Well, I worry about whether I'm going to wake up tomorrow and democracy is going to be gone, right? That's the tipping point that we're at right now. It is so precarious. It's like hanging on by a hair. And all I need is another headline to discover that civil war is broken out the current moment. And so, yes, that probably worries me as much. If I was to go one step beyond that immediate fear, it would be about the death of the planet and environmental crisis and so forth. But that's so hard to hold in your mind, even to comprehend the end of all life in the universe. And so it's not something that plagues me when I go to bed at night, but the failure of democracy does.
You really suss these out beautifully. And Marshall McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions. So you brought up the word meta. They're even deeper than unintended consequences. We don't know how Facebook has really shaped us. We live in a Facebook world, okay, whether you do it or not. But McLuhan's, and then what Pound taught him was, then if we turn to the artist to reveal these hidden psychic effects, we can learn how to cope with what we don't like about them. So Marshall's main question, one of his main questions, and I ask you, is why do humans ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though artists are broadcasting them to us?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, McLuhan told us media are put out before they're thought out. And I've always found that an interesting idea, that we put media into the universe before we fully understand them. But I would say with digital media, we reached a point where if thinking's faster than the speed of light, as we said earlier, theorists are predicting technology. We already have theories of the metaverse, say, even though that's not quite a thing yet. We're already theorizing what it's going to be, what it's going to do to people. We may be wrong, but we're theorizing. And so theory is everywhere in our society. I don't think media being put out before they're thought out holds much truth claim anymore. But but there has to be a conversation around each new media as it's introduced. McLuhan talked about the effect of a new medium as numbing, that it freezes the area. I think it's quite the opposite. It's a sharp pain or a sharp joy that we need to comprehend, but not everyone is prepared to confront that side of media, as you say, the hidden psychic effects, and instead get distracted. McLuhan talks about meaning as being the meat the burglar uses to distract the dog to get inside the house. I don't totally agree with him on that, but this idea that the content overrides any awareness of anything else that might be taking place, the new relationship of the senses, the new dynamics of space and time that a new media creates, are important to understand and are important for us to know as we choose to engage with this new medium or not.
That was good, and it evoked the other McLuhan quote here that I'm curious your interpretation of it. Everybody experiences far more than they understand, yet it is experience rather than understanding that influences behavior.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, McLuhan often is creating these probes, which he knows are consciously paradoxical, right? And
Yeah.
are meant, like your questions are meant, to force us to think quickly and process maybe only half processed ideas to get to some deeper thing. So I think this relationship between analysis and experience is interesting. In academia, I come to distrust analysis which is not grounded in experience, right? Raymond Williams, who's one of my favorite theorists of media, describes his experiences of culture and pits them against the analysis of his teachers, saying that you have not seen my culture, you do not understand my experience, and so your theories seem empty to me. They don't touch the skin, they don't touch the essence of who I am. And so from Raymond Williams, we get the idea that the goal of theory is to articulate different kinds of cultural identities and experiences, and to test theoretical judgments that may be prematurely delivered from an abstract, objectified position, rather than coming from a place of experiential knowledge. And so my own work has been very often about disrupting the rational analysis of the academy in favor of allowing other groups whose experiences have been ignored to be articulated in the theories that we're putting out there.
Wow, that was heavy. My friend went up to Richard Schinkel, the great film book writer, and he said, this was just before he died. He says, "So what do you think of McLuhan?" And he goes, "Fraud." And then Richard goes, "Well, semi-fraud." and it was interesting because I said, you should have said, "Well, what do you think of him as a manipulative satirist?" Because I think Donald Thiel, one of Marshall's best students, nailed it when he said Marshall teased people to believe his percepts were concepts. So his feeling, he was teasing. So when they call him a media theorist in Wikipedia, that's wrong. He says, I don't have theories, but he would go along with it because he's an academic. And it's fine to call me a theorist, but I'm going to fake you out and I'm going to put you on, but I'm not going to do it to expose you. I'm just going to do it to play, like you say, to play.
Well, one of my favorite McLuhan lines is in Annie Hall when he says, "You're saying my whole fallacy is wrong."
Right.
Which I think has been read as a misspeech at the point he was suffering from his tumor. But I think he probably meant literally, "You're saying my whole fallacy is wrong." That he's using fallacy instead of theory.
No,
that's
Henry,
really interesting.
Yeah, I think this is when we met at USC once at a film screening. We just happened to sit next to each other. I think I might have told you this then. What Woody did, because he couldn't get Louis Buñuel or Fellini, Marshall was his third choice. He made Marshall say his entire thing backwards. And Marshall would say, hey, half a truth is still a lot of truth. Marshall would say that statement like this: do you mean my whole fallacy is wrong? As a question. He was
Yes.
about sending new questions. Woody made him say it as a statement. You mean my whole fallacy is wrong? So, it's interesting. And there's a super great filmmaker who I know became a super great filmmaker, Rian Johnson, because of that very scene in Annie Hall. He says,
Oh, it's an incredible scene.
I'm going to become a filmmaker because of that. But that was good. So,
Yeah, I mean, when I teach McLuhan, I tell my students that the first time I read McLuhan, it was in a paperback book shaped like someone's butt because they'd been sitting on and riding a motorcycle across America, and that it's partially about that embeddedness, the embodiment of McLuhan's ideas, that he framed them in a way that they could be part of common knowledge. I also have my students read his interview in Playboy, which is the most coherent introduction to McLuhan's thought. And it brings attention to the fact that McLuhan was a theorist who could appear in a men's magazine, that he would go anywhere and talk to anyone about those ideas. But you're right, they were always questions and probes, not statements in the end. And I think that's where people who can't figure out the coherence of McLuhan thought get lost, is they're not meant to be coherent. They're meant to be tools for thinking through things.
you're the book shaped as a butt goes along with Andrew McLuhan, who's upholding the tradition now, Eric's son. And he was a punk rocker. And after one of his gigs, he looked down into the mosh pit and there was a copy of The Medium is a Massage on the floor.
Well, it was everywhere at a certain moment in time. Everyone was reading it and discussing it. Your jokes on Laugh-In, right? So
jokes.
Popularity of McLuhan is part of what interests me about it. I don't always agree with some of the interpretations of McLuhan, but the idea of making ideas popularly available into every media channel is always what I've modeled myself on from McLuhan's work.
Yeah, it's like Jack Nicholson said, I wrote the movie Head for the Monkees while reading McLuhan. And just yesterday, I found out that Pete Townsend said he wrote Tommy when he was reading McLuhan.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah. So are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
Generally, I'm afraid of old ideas. I mean, there are certainly old ideas that I value and cherish and want to carry forward, but holding on to the past is a way of crushing the innovation of culture and preventing other voices that have been shut out of the past from being heard. And so I think old ideas smother us, and I think new ideas allow us to breathe.
Beautiful. We're going to go into a little of your personal background, but you've covered that so interestingly. I tell you, your talks on YouTube and your lectures are an epitome of what I said to students is get your life and your job as mixed up as possible.
Like absolutely.
And so can you conjure up your earliest memory ever or one of them?
Well, I have a memory of my mother watching the JFK assassination, not the assassination, but its aftermath on television and ironing. And I was laying on my bed. And since I was born in 58, that's relatively young. What are we talking? 63, 62?
63 would be at the age of 5. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a very early memory for me. And the emotions of it is what I remember more than anything else, not knowing who this person was, but realizing that someone significant in the life of my mother had died, even though I probably at that 5 wouldn't have understood even what death was, but that something had hurt my mother. was very, very powerful for me. The earliest film I can remember on watching was Mary Poppins at the Fox Theater in Atlanta on a massive screen, and I still have just such an immediate emotional response to that film because of that early formative experience.
Yeah, we have similar. Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
I think it's a blessing. I mean, my mother's been dead for almost 20 years now, but the ability to bring her back, you know, she comes back in my dreams often, but to bring her back consciously in my thoughts and think about those moments and replay them and to engage with them is a real gift. And I think the older one gets, the more you value the treasure house of memories that you've built up. Certainly trauma produces memories too, and I'm not saying memories can't pain us, they often do. Even good memories pain us if they're memories of someone we can't access and engage with now, like my mother. But I think the blessing of being able to bring her back into my thought is far greater than the curse of feeling the trauma of loss all over again.
Wow. Did your parents raise you a particular religion?
I was raised a Southern Baptist. My grandfather was a deacon. My father was a deacon. My mother sang in the church choir and ran vacation Bible school. That was the religion I was raised on. And at a certain point, being a Baptist became equated with being ultra conservative, right? And the church itself was getting rid of people who were too progressive in their thinking. And it was a kind of bloodletting that went on in the church. This is the late 70s, early 80s. And so I reached a point where the people who had taught me things that were crucial to my own religious belief were being thrown out of the church. And I realized I didn't belong there anymore, that if I couldn't come in search of spiritual, you know, peace, but came instead to just cringe as the minister said things that I found deeply offensive and politically wrong-headed, then I felt like I couldn't go there anymore. And so it's, people could say I backslid. That's an expression Baptists use, but I felt like I was exiled, not that I had, backslid or failed in my religious quest. But at this point, I'm really fairly confused and maybe searching, but not knowing answers with anywhere near the certainty of the fundamentalist tradition I was raised in. And I become deeply distrustful of any kind of fundamentalism. So if you're quoting Freud or Marx as scripture, you turn me off really quickly. If it's a question, like we were talking about with McLuhan, then it's far more interesting and I can engage with that hypothesis about the universe. But when you tell me it's true because Marx said it, to me it's no different than reading a red letter edition of the Bible and someone telling me, well, it's true because the Bible said, or because Jesus said. I'm not looking for fundamental faith at this point. I'm looking for any tool that opens up our pursuit of truth.
That is so well put. You really anticipated something here. Do you pray, Henry?
Sometimes, not as often as I probably should. I think if we think of prayer as focusing your thoughts and energy toward a goal that you would hope to come true, and controlling your breathing, maybe, which is one thing that I do a lot in meditation, then I think that wishing of goodwill toward other people. I wish there was some simple way to say that, right? So I can't, in a multicultural, multi-religious society, say in good conscience anymore, I'll pray for you, because that doesn't work as cultural currency. But to say that you're sending good thoughts and good energy towards someone maybe comes closer to what prayer would have meant to me when I was more solid in my faith in the Baptist tradition.
I suggest the 4-H club. Remember that? But
Sure.
I changed it. Hoping, happy, healthy, healing.
Aha.
I just made it up as a joke. But anyways, if God does exist, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
Well, I'd love the thing about that the afterlife that I've always liked is the idea of being reunited with the people you loved and cared for in life. And so maybe here's my mother, here's my father is something that would be really meaningful as a response to that question. That is the hope that we find our way back to those human connections we began talking about.
Yeah.
Still, to me, is what would drive me toward that would be my idea of heaven at this point.
That touched me deep in my heart. I appreciate that. I agree with you. But I got to tell you, this guy I think he's in Brazil, Wilson Oliveira, he wrote a book on McLuhan in film. Really sharp guy. I said that question to him a couple weeks ago. What do you want God to say to you after you die? He goes, quit reading so much McLuhan. which is funny because your fundamentalist thing is like, don't be so fundamentalist, Jerry. Quit quoting McLuhan and Zappa and Duchamp all the time. And my friend says, just say it in your own words. So I really like what you said about that. Someone who just quotes Freud and Marx all the time. It's really so. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Oh, I think that there probably are people historically that are evil. We'd have to define what evil is. And I think our modern definition of evil is someone who destroys other people purely for their own personal gain. So, in that criteria, to my mind, Hitler is evil and
Yeah.
Trump is evil, right? Yeah. And I don't mean to draw an absolute equivalence between the two. I mean, Trump put children in cages, but he didn't put them in gas chambers, and therefore there are distinctions to be drawn there. But I see that sense of being willing to burn a society down to the ground because your ego can't accept the fact you lost something as a pretty good modern definition of evil.
Yeah. How do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? I'm going to tell a few modern thinkers' thoughts. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurais. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. The basic question, Henry, is how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
Well, there's some situations where that is absolutely true. I can think of a rival academic who has made his career out of attacking me and is not a particularly well-known figure. If I used my platforms to respond to him, I would be amplifying his thoughts rather than really even engaging with them. And I found this guy, because when he first started the attacks, I reached out to him to engage in a conversation to see if we could sort through our differences and find common ground, and he absolutely refused to engage with me. So if you can't engage, then you shouldn't amplify, right? That's my basic philosophy. But 9 times out of 10, I reach out to my critics to engage in the conversation. I want to know what I can learn from them. But I also believe often the criticisms come from a misunderstanding. And if I can understand what they're perceiving me as, I can both adjust myself and maybe take away some of the sting of the critique. So I have many of my closest friends started out as enemies before I began this process of really trying to find that common ground and to clarify misunderstandings and then see where we disagree. And at that point, if the disagreement is not animosity but curiosity, then the disagreement is an enormously productive thing and they become great thinking partners for me.
Beautiful. That's American Indian Indigenous say, your enemy is your best teacher. James Joyce was the first projectionist cinema theater owner in Dublin over 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said, sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Well, I think media in all forms puts a frame around something and forces us to pay attention to it in a different way, right? It's a conceptual frame. In many cases, it's literally a frame of a painting, a proscenium in a theater, the edge of the screen in cinema. But that act of cutting out a piece of reality and saying, look, pay attention to this, forces us to look at things we might observe and might walk by and not observe, the details of our world that we become blind to. You know, the Russian formalists talk about breaking the glass armor, shattering the glass that separates us from a direct perception of the world. And the glass is something like you drive home and you get home and you say, "Did I actually cross that bridge?" I don't remember when we crossed the bridge tonight because I've crossed that bridge every night for the last 10 years. You don't see the bridge anymore. And that numbing, the blinding of reality requires defamiliarization, is what the Russian formalist would say. And that art defamiliarizes the real and forces us to question it at a deeper level. And that's what fascinates me about media. I mean, I've been studying media my entire life. I study all kinds of media, but understanding those acts of framing and reshaping that media perform in order to get us to see the world through new eyes, I think is a really fascinating thing, and how different cultures make different choices about what parts of reality to pay attention to or not. You know, I first started watching Japanese horror films and they really got under my skin. And it was in part because I knew if I watched an American film, the conventions would tell me where it was going to go and where it wasn't going to go. But watching a Japanese horror film with a different cultural tradition and a different sense of taboos was like riding a roller coaster with a blindfold on, right? I couldn't see where it was going to go next. I didn't know how far it was going to go beyond what an American movie would do, and that was utterly terrifying for me the first time. So I had emotional experiences with those films that I had long lost watching American equivalents of those films.
Wow. Yeah, Henry, you sort of explained this. The question is, what first attracted you to become what you are? Cultural. I mean, in 2 words, what do you call yourself? A cultural critic or a how do you?
I
What's
mean, yeah, cultural critic is good. Cultural
okay?
scholar,
Yeah, cultural scholar,
media scholar. I mean,
media scholar.
we can you call it whatever we want.
Right. And so I was really intrigued. You said the character in the Disney cartoon who was a professor, sort of absent-minded, but he covered everything. He was comprehensive.
Yes.
I loved that. That was beautiful. But I'm even asking a little deeper. What's before that? More your parents' DNA or something else that incited your curiosity to do that kind of exploration? What's even deeper than that? Carol.
Well, the duck we're referring to is Ludwig von Drake, who was an icon on the Disneyland television program, and was like the professor in Gilligan's Island, someone who knew everything about everything except how to get off the island. But for me, so that notion of a broad-reaching intellect is something that has always appealed to me. My parents were very much that way in their own ways. My father was in the world of construction, and he could not sit still. And if he saw a problem in the world, he felt compelled to fix it. And he knew all the tools, and he was just constantly thinking and sketching and trying to do practical things. My mother was a clown who did performances at charity circuses. And so for her, laughter was maybe the thing she was after, bringing joy to people. And I have a portrait on my wall of my mother dressed as a clown that was painted by her best friend. And when I was quite young, she dressed me up like a clown, little mini me clown who followed her around on stage and performed. So between them, I got both a pragmatic side and a playful side, a clowning side that I think guides a lot of the work that I do. So this was, the world I grew up in. They both valued imagination a lot, and they would support my fascinations with media from an early age. In my office, I have some monster models, the Aurora monster models of Wolfman and Dracula, the two that I have on my desk. I have maybe a dozen that I made with my father. And he would stay up late making these models because he supported my fascination with horror films, say. And he would drive halfway across the city to go to a drive-in movie where I'd fall asleep 15 minutes in, and he would have to tell me the story the following day. But mother would loan me her eyeshadow and, went to a funeral home to track down mortuary wax because Famous Monsters of Filmland said that it was really good for creating scar makeup. So I was enormously supported by my parents in a fantasy life that was constantly translating media knowledge and expertise into cultural performance. And I was play acting stories from a very early age in the backyard. I entered fandom at a very early age. So all of my sense of interest in people rewriting, reperforming, remixing media, which is a central theme running through my life, I think I would owe to that strange chemistry of my mother's clowning and my father's tools.
That was so well put, and you're brief and concise, dude. This is amazing. So I want to stay on laughter for a second in the clowning. Your favorite cultural critic writer, is reviewing you in your other career. You became a famous comedian. Who would you want them to say? Henry is a cross between who and who if you became a comedian clown or, a comedian.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly would want Groucho Marx in the mix because the Marx brothers are really formative to me.
Yeah.
And maybe I would toss in Ernie Kovacs because of his
that's great.
enormous awareness of the media he's performing in and his constant desire to call attention to the platform he's using for his own comedy. So that would be a very highly self-reflexive style of comedy, but it also would, coming out of Groucho, be deeply irreverent toward any establishment or authority. And that probably sums up my theory pretty well.
It's pretty good. Really good. I agree to it. What's the function of laughter?
Well, I think laughter is about communicating with other people around us the pleasure we found in the discoveries we make. It's a byproduct of comedy. Comedy is about thinking of the world, perceiving the world in a new way. But laughter is that sense of, aha, I found it. I found something that I really like. And so it doesn't really matter in the end of the day whether laughter is performative or organic and uncontrollable, because the signaling function is more or less the same, right? Yes, I can laugh uncontrollably at something, but it's also powerful. There are moments where I simply laugh to tell my students, look, what's going on here is important to pay attention to. And it becomes a pedagogical gesture when I'm watching a movie in the dark with a group of students.
Yeah. Gurdjieff said laughter is the reconciliation of yes and no. And Marshall loved to quote Steve Allen saying, behind every joke, there's a grievance. I don't like every, but I wanted just to you jump off those and add one more to the twist is I ask people, can satire be destructive? Now, most people go, yes, you do a cartoon in a certain country and they kill you. That death is destructive.
Yeah, that's fairly true.
Right. But Jonathan Swift compared satire to a mirror in which people could see every face but their own. And one person who wrote comedy with Robin Williams, I said, can satire be destructive? He says, that's the job of satire. And so just sort of jump off on any of those,
Yeah, well, I think about Mary Douglas, the anthropologist who writes and wrote several episodes, one of which is called Do Dogs Laugh, which I always loved as a title. But Mary Douglas says that a joke comes when we put into coherent form something that the community largely believes but can't yet put into words. So she says if it is something the community is not prepared to accept, it's read as an insult. If it sparks a sense of consensus, she says it becomes a joke. And so the comedian is constantly probing the culture, walking that line, trying to decide where the taboo still lies, what the raw nerves are, and what is an acceptable form of joke. Hence the phrase too soon, right? When you give a joke and it's too soon, the thought hasn't congealed or become acceptable within the community. It's still processing its emotion. The joke comes too soon. And yes, it's the job of the comedian to map the culture in that way. And it's like a dentist with a little probe hitting each tooth and saying, does that hurt? Does that hurt? Does that hurt? And sooner or later, it's going to hurt. But, he can't figure out where the toothache is until he hits it with the probe a number of times. And I think a comedian's up there on the stage saying, let me tell you this, does that hurt? Does that hurt? Does that hurt? And you laugh until you can't laugh, and it hurts too much to laugh, and then you get angry and cancel him, is the way we deal with it in the modern world.
Yikes. Well, it's like, it's almost this through line I discovered. Buster Keaton was hurting himself, pratfalls, so we could laugh. Then the next in line is Chris Burden was hurting himself in calling it art. And then the third is Jackass. They hurt themselves and make a lot of money.
Yes. They figured out something that Buster Keaton and the modern art performance artists never quite figured out, is how to make money out of this thing.
Like vaudeville. And then you really nailed it. What George Carlin said, the job of the comedian is to draw a line and then cross it.
Yes. I think that's essentially what Mary Douglas is saying.
Yeah.
And I think I always find that really helpful, because then as an analyst, I can use the joke to understand how the culture is processing a given topic. And it becomes a great analytic tool to look at the jokes and clowns of a given culture.
Henry, a screenwriting teacher told me great art or great film is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great film or great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process?
In my creative process, there's enough of a surrealist in me that I like surprises and things that emerge organically from the work, but I also think through everything to a deep level. There's very little unconsciousness that finally makes it on the page when I'm working something. I'll not necessarily say everything on the page. I leave space for my readers, but I'm trying to communicate a set of ideas that I've thought through at a pretty deep level. So yeah, my intentionality is important for me in my own work. As someone who writes about fans, I'm much more playful with notions of intentionality, right? I don't care if William Shatner thinks that my reading of Star Trek is wrong and that Star Trek was just made for entertainment purposes. It's only a TV show. Get a life. It doesn't matter. It annoys the hell out of me, but it doesn't matter. If I want to play with that material and make up a new story where Kirk and Spock are lovers and Uhura becomes a militant feminist living in a lesbian separatist colony or whatever. These are all ideas floating around in fan fiction out there. That is my right as the reader, that once you throw it out in the universe, it belongs to your readers, not to you, and they're going to do with it what they want. So I love to see people's appropriation and remixing of my ideas. And I showcase them on my blog when I stumble into them, or my social media space, because it's a victory for me of penetrating into the everyday conversation enough that people want to remix me and want to transform what I said. So their intentionality goes out the window. It's the right of the reader, not the right of the author that I work from. But in my own creative process, I imagine myself putting some truth out into the universe that's carefully thought through and carefully crafted. And I want to be as clear as I possibly can so that people understand what my ideas are. And then what they do with them, that's up to them.
Yeah, this is all resonating in my heart, mind, and soul. Thank you. Duchamp. Well, I have this thing that I says, great art fucks your shit up, and you say to yourself, I could do that. But let's see.
That's part of what I say about fan Fan
Yeah.
fiction is what gives it its power, is that so much of it is bad. Because
Yeah.
in a world where you only see great art, you can't aspire to create something yourself. But
Yeah.
in a world where you can be bad and get insights and get better, that's
Yeah.
a world where more and more people can create meaningful things. So for me,
Yeah.
fan fiction as a site is powerful because a lot of it is amateur and struggling
Yeah.
to express itself, but there's a support network around it that enables people to learn and grow.
Yeah. Beautiful. And Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your reader when you're writing your book?
Oh, every step of the way. I mean,
Yeah.
as someone who studies readers, I can't disconnect my theory from my practice. And so I am constantly looking at every word and saying, first of all, is this clear? How could this be misunderstood? How could this be used against me? But also, does this incite something in the reader? Am I blurring the lines in such a way that feeling and thinking are brought together in the words that I put on the page, so they both feel something and think something in response to what I wrote? And is it generative? Is it provocative? Does it produce new thought? So I've been very lucky to have coined a lot of phrases in my writing that have been picked up and used widely by other people. And that process of seeing my ideas spread and have new layers put on it is part of the pleasure of writing. So some years back, I got invited to be a respondent on a panel on my influence on religious studies. And I've never done anything with religious studies as far as I knew. And to get there and hear people taking my ideas, my theories of media, and apply them to the study of religious practice, and then say, "No, so what do you think about that?" And it was like, I was almost speechless and so moved at the end of the
Beautiful.
process that something I had written had been picked up in a totally different field, and people had built ideas and dissertations around that. That's hugely exciting to me. So when I do think of the audience, but not simply an audience I'm going to dominate, but an audience I'm going to collaborate with and produce something new at the connections between their brains and mine.
Beautiful. What was the motive of the cave artist? Not what Herzog said or the New Yorker article he based his film on or anthropologist. What's your hunch?
Well, one of the interesting things I stumbled on recently was BBC did a history of noise as a podcast, and what they told us about was the musicologists had gone into caves and looked at acoustics inside caves, and then turned the light on, and almost every place they got an acoustic hotspot, they found the cave painting. That this is bound up, so sound and image were bound up to each other from the very beginning. That art was multimodal as far back as we know that there's art. We don't even know if they had language, but they had amplification of sound, which tells us they probably growled at the cave bear and grunted as they maybe danced around with spheres toward the game that's pictured in those paintings. That there was social art with those handprints on the wall where multiple hands are pressing the wall with pigment. That there was a kind of sociality around art from the very beginning. And so art was an event, an occasion, a mediated experience before it was anything else. Now, I don't know what sparks that first impulse, but I think it seems to be about shared experiences or shared
Yeah.
emotions based on everything we can see from that research about sound and cave painting.
Beautiful. One guy a couple of weeks ago said, what was the motive of the cave artist? He said, to keep people in the cave.
Well, there's a certain amount of fear to that. I heard someone else say that the themes were those of adolescence, in the same way that video games were themes adolescence. So it's sex and violence,
Yeah.
aggression.
Yeah.
Those are the things that are there, and they're not old guys themes.
Yeah.
They're not the themes of parents and children. They are about that adrenaline rush, and maybe that's been at the heart of a lot of technological innovation from the very beginning, is
Totally.
adolescence male power fantasies.
Back to your playground. I asked Eric McLuhan, say your whole world in one word after the word the. Like Zappa's would be the big note. So that's cheating, 2 words. But the, and people would say, like Finnegan's Wake, the wake, or James Joyce, the wake. And so I said, Eric, what would you say? And he goes, the playground. I says, what would your dad say? And he goes, the playground.
Yep, that sounds about right.
So yours, what would yours be? The fill in the blank.
Huh. I mean, you've already used the playground. I mean, I could cheat and say the participatory culture, but that's 2 words unless
No, that's
we
good.
smash them together. But
Well,
that's
that's
probably
really
as close as I can get.
no, that's really good. I love it. It's cheating's good. I like really quick divert. Don't sell out, sneak in. That's Reverend Al of Flipside Magazine. And
I like that.
And Paul Schrader said the role of the artist is to attempt to sell out but fail. so Patti Smith sold luggage, full page ad, Wall Street Journal and New York Times a couple weeks ago. Sell out or not?
Well, I was in a panel once, and with Robert McChesney, who's a sharp critic of media industries, and we were both asked the question: if a major corporation offered you money to come in and tell them what was wrong with them, would you accept the invitation and would you accept the money? And Robert seemed to believe that he should maintain distance and therefore should not talk to them. And if he did talk to them, not accept the money because it would be selling out. And my position was I go anywhere that anyone's willing to listen. And I don't do pro bono work for corporations. I take the money and I apply it, allow me to talk to another group who can't afford me, right? I've got to live. The other group needs to hear what I've got to say. And if a corporation is going to subsidize that, I don't see that as selling out. I just see it as, money changing hands.
Right.
And so I can't be bought by the small amount of money companies offer me when I speak to them.
But that's what Marshall did. That they GE gave him $5,000. Tell us how to sell cars better, and he would yap out, and they'd all scratch their heads, and then he'd go to church at noon, and they'd follow him to mass. But
I mean, they pay me to bite the hand that feeds me when they do it. They're paying me to say something negative that they can't hear from their own employees because the employees has to maintain loyalty. So I come in and I deliver some critique, and then people pad up to me in the men's room or as I'm leaving the building, young junior folks, and say, I've been trying to get my stupid boss to hear that for a long time. He heard it from you and he's going to act on it. From me, he didn't hear it. But I find that companies listen to you only if they pay you. That if, they only value what they pay for, and therefore to get their attention, I have to accept their money. So that's what selling out means in my world. Is that choice.
Yeah, but I understand. I just want you to make a value judgment, and you don't have to. But Patti Smith represents punk rock. She's the godmother. And, she sells books, and someone goes, almost everybody I've asked said, oh, she might need the money, or maybe she's giving the money to a good cause. But what it represents is she's not selling her poetry or music. She's selling luggage.
So, I think it also suggests, before that, I heard 24th Floor playing on Muzak in a grocery store, right? So the song that in my youth represented this radical disruption, right? Patti Smith saying she masturbated to her own photographs is one of the statements that I remember as a young man just sort of blew my mind. And Patti was my queen, my rock queen when I was an undergraduate. So the fact that this has become mainstream means a certain degree of influence and success, that those ideas have penetrated in. And yes, the rough edges have been softened out, right? Patti saying, I haven't fucked much with the past, but I have fucked with the future. That attitude, I think, is, really powerful still. I think she still has the potential to disrupt, but I think what she stands for has become more widely accepted, and the sense of pleasure in her own body that's represented by that statement that she masturbates to her own picture, the lack of sexual shame that Patti Smith embodied for a generation, now maybe we've come some step along the way to catching up with where Patty was at.
Yeah.
In the 80s when I first started listening to Easter over and over and over again.
Beautiful. Yeah, because Iggy's sucked corporate cock his whole fucking, not his whole career, but in the last, way before Patty was. Anyways, is loyalty based on reason?
Well, I think we form loyalty in part based on a rational choice, but loyalty is only tested when we're willing to go beyond pure reason towards some kind of emotional connection to someone. I'm someone who's deeply, deeply loyal, and it pains me to my core if I have to break loyalty with someone. But I also think loyalty comes with a conscience. And there are moments where we're loyal to someone and we have to push away and saying, you're not true to yourself. You're doing things that value your core, that damage your core values. And being loyal to someone means you're willing to say that. And that can seem disloyal at times. But I think at a deeper level, that is loyalty. And so I don't know if that's rationality when we do that, but I think it is a sense of something wrong when we're being asked to be loyal to something that violates the core principles that we signed on for when we gave our loyalty to a cause or toward a leader or toward a friend.
Very good. Henry, I asked for 90 minutes. We got 15 more minutes. Can you go longer than that?
I can go a little longer. I don't have a
Okay.
hard stop today.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Do artists have a moral obligation?
I think so. Yes, I think artists are creating works that become the raw materials for the society around them. And they have an obligation not to put pollution into that environment, right? I can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. So if all you're giving me is a sow's ear, you're debasing the culture around us. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone's going to agree about what is good and what's debasing. And I think the artist has to exercise their own conscience as they're making those choices. And I'm not advocating censorship. I'm advocating an artist taking responsibility over the choices they make and the consequences they might have. And I'm deeply troubled when I see an artist who's not willing to have some responsibility over the impact of what their work is. I don't see art as burning everything down. I see art as serving some social or moral purpose.
So Stanley Kubrick pulled Clockwork Orange for 30 years off the UK screens only because the authorities said, "Hey, your film's causing kids to beat up winos," and so he went along with it. You're just guess or hunch. Was it more because deep down inside he knew it was good publicity stunt, or because he really thought his film was causing kids to beat up winos?
Well, I suspect if he believed that, it was probably wrong, but I don't know. I don't know enough about Kubrick per se. I've done a lot of work on media violence and its effect, and I think it's always mediated by real world factors. The real world factors trump media effects every day of the week. So media doesn't by itself make us more violent. It may reinforce, though, a set of beliefs. If I'm raised in a household where domestic violence is widespread and I accept that as norm and I see representations that glorify domestic violence, I am more likely to act on those impulses because they reinforce my beliefs.
Yeah.
But it is unlikely to change my beliefs. That if I'm raised in a constructive environment and I have no real antisocial impulses, then media may simply allow me to probe those sides of myself and walk away clean. So if Clockwork Orange was quote causing British youth to beat up winos, it could well be because of the sharp class divides that were disrupting Thatcher's England during the time that that film would have been out on the market, and a normalization of violence in everyday life is part of British masculinity that could make that film a particular, incendiary work. I don't happen to think it probably was, but I can understand. I've known plenty of artists who have seen alleged effects of their work and been deeply troubled by it. And I have to trust them when they tell me that that's what they're really experiencing. And I've seen other artists who thumbed their nose at it and walked away,
Yeah,
not caring about the effect of what they made.
Yeah, John Joe's kid walked up to him and says, "Your film helped me get into the Occupy movement." And he goes, "Don't blame me."
Ah,
But just before the clockwork, Frank Zappa did a PSA on the radio, and it said, "Don't do speed; it'll turn you into your parents."
well, that's an effective message for that generation.
But a couple experimental film icons, George Manupelli's, his mantra is ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas said, there is no self-expression. Great jazz pianist Cecil Taylor says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. So, of course, I know it's both and it depends, but your hunch, Henry, is art making more self-expression or more your vehicle for whatever culture or technology is dominant?
I probably fall on the side of culture and technology as much more than self-expression. I think there's an element of self-expression, as you say, it's sometimes both. But I think at the end of the day, we can only say those things that our culture makes it possible for us to say. That I may feel things that I want to express personally, but I lack a language to express it through. And I can only communicate what the audience or reader is prepared to hear and understand, which means the whole thing is bound up by the culture around me. Doesn't mean I'm simply a vehicle of the culture, but it means that everything I try to express is mediated through the cultural language I have to communicate. And those could be pictures, that could be sounds, that could be words, but the cultural materials are where we start. We don't start with a blank slate. We start with what's around us. As Mikhail Bakhtin said, you don't take words from the dictionary, you take words from other people's mouths, and they come dripping with associations of where they've been before. So the idea of writing is swapping spit, I think, is a really interesting way of thinking about how we draw on the culture and add our own materials to it, bodily or otherwise, as we spread, as we make something that's a new way of understanding the culture, but it is still starts from the raw materials our culture gives us.
Can art making be egoless?
Probably not. I mean, I think we always have an ego investment from the moment our mother takes a picture we drew before we even know what art is, and it's hung on the refrigerator door, and we're said, good boy. That ego stroking takes place around art. I don't think there's any moment when a kid picks up a pen and a crayon that there's not some sense of evaluation and praise associated with it. Or conversely, if he draws on the wall and damages something, he's bad boy, right? And that's negative. But either way, those primal experiences of art bring ego into it, and I don't think it ever goes away again.
I spoke with Michael Apted, the great movie director, 40 years ago. I says, why do rock video editors feel so obliged to edit fast? He says, because people have learned to take in information faster. Most people don't know Abel Gance invented rapid montage in 1922, but it really flourished 40 years ago. MTV, Marty says, I cut my films faster because of MTV. I asked this question with a bias. Can humans literally learn to take in information faster, or are we just brainwashed to believe we can?
Oh, that's a tricky one, because I agree. I was about to bring up Abel Gance or Sergei Eisenstein. When I show those films to my students, they have trouble processing the levels of them, right? Abel Gance is not only doing rapid montage, but on 3 different screens and shifting relations between those 3 screens simultaneously with superimpositions on top of rapid edits. I think the information processing in Napoleon and its key moments is far beyond anything that MTV has ever done. So I don't think, if we believe this, it's not a simple linear evolutionary model that allows us to think about processing this. I do think there's skill and cognitive capacity questions involved with montage, I think, research has looked at Soviet montage, which depended on literary metaphors. And if you read that against the work that Soviet psychologists were doing with peasant people who had very literal ideas about the associations between things, it's very clear that Eisenstein misfired, wasn't understood at all by the audience he intended to reach because it lacked the literary basis for the analogies that Eisenstein was trying to express through his montage. So that's about processing analogy through montage rather than simply processing perception. Napoleon doesn't, by and large, depend on processing analogy. It depends on a visceral experience of power and, dynamism that comes on a very perceptual level. It's what Eisenstein would have called rhythmic montage, not cognitive montage, conceptual montage. But I think, yes, there are moments in time where style teaches us to see the world in new ways. And I think we process that and we learn to process it, we learn to read it, we learn to make those connections. But I don't think it's as simple as kids today are so much sharper than their parents. And while we're at it, they discovered sex for the first time, right? Or these other claims we make about the modern generation progressing beyond its parents. I think at best it's cyclical. In general, it's, this is a human capacity that different artists at different moments pushes toward, and we need to exercise it more in response to some works than others. But I'm not convinced it's as simple as we know how to read it today and they didn't know how to do it 40 years ago.
Is it literally possible for humans to multitask?
Oh, I got myself in trouble years ago by saying multitasking was a skill, a new media literacy skill. I do think it is. But multitasking may simply be the capacity to shift modes of attention rapidly from one thing to the other, in which case it's not literally multitasking, it's a rapid shift in attention. Now, the problem is that the research cognitively on multitasking starts from the assumption that we can only process one thing at a time and never really test the alternative. That if you look at the methodologies by which they're telling you humans cannot multitask, it's grounded in experiments that only assume one modality at a time. There's no real proof that we can't.
Yeah.
There is proof that we don't necessarily do our best thinking when we're trying to do two things at once, where our attention is limited and that was a limited amount of attention, which is why the idea of shifting attention across layers of taking in your environment and then drilling down on particulars and so forth makes sense. And if you've got nervous energy that's distracting you from paying attention, then the ability to do something with body memory as you're doing something that requires conscious thought may be possible. Hence, I think of a colleague of mine who knits all the way through the faculty meeting. And she's paying attention to the meeting, but she can pay more attention when she knits than she can if she's not. And that's the bodily energy is taking away some of the distraction in her work that allows her to focus more. And I think the same thing is true when the student, the teenager says, well, I do my best studying when I have the music on.
Yeah.
And if what they're experiencing is the rhythm of the music through their body and not lyrics, which get in my head when I try to write, I do write better when I'm listening to music, not necessarily the same music the next generation would listen to, but I do better when I have a human voice that gives me a sense of security and presence and a rhythm that shapes my emotions to some degree and maybe gives me a sense of empowerment and allows me to feel a sense of surging. That is to some degree multitasking. It is just not paying equal attention to both of those inputs at the same time.
I know it's both. That depends. What's more important, conviction or compromise?
Whew. Well, I think right now what's more important is compromise, right? The ability to bring us closer to each other is what we vitally need. Now, I think you cannot have good compromise without some moral grounding, some sense of what you're willing to compromise on and what principles you can't compromise. Otherwise, compromise is surrender, right? It's just saying whatever, do it. Instead, what you want is, this is what I'm willing to fight for, and this is what I'm willing to trade to get it. And that requires some degree of conviction on both sides. And if the things you can trade align, and you can make progress toward things that you both care about, then compromise is possible. But when you compromise your soul, you have gained nothing, right? There is no outcome that is beneficial to anyone when you compromise your core convictions. But the problem right now is that we're saying conviction is demonstrated by a refusal to compromise. And I find that we're seeing the social effects of that. So in Washington on January 6th, a year ago, where conviction means we cannot compromise. We do not trust the system. We do not trust our fellow citizens. We'd rather burn it all down than allow an outcome other than the one that we agree to. And that's taking conviction beyond a point of conviction to something that's monolithic. Whereas to me, compromise comes when I agree to give you some things you want, and in order to achieve something that I have a deep conviction for.
Yeah, it really, you're resonating a lot with goes inside my head, and I appreciate it. My favorite answer ever was, what's more important, conviction or compromise? The guy goes, depends on what you mean by important. And that's what you sort of do. You're a comprehensivist. You're like McLuhan saying understanding is not having a point of view. You have your point of view, but you go like Pascal. In order to understand anything, you got to know this end of the spectrum and that and everything in between, and I appreciate that. Is perception reality?
Well, I don't think we have a way to reality except through perception, which is not the same thing as saying perception is reality. But in some level, it doesn't matter, because if it's a reality that we don't experience through one or more of our senses, it is not something we can comprehend, that we can't engage with it. And I suspect there are parts of reality we don't comprehend on that way. And maybe someday we meet an alien who has a totally different set of senses and sees parts of the real that we can't get to. I'm totally open to that as a possibility. But I think, the only way I can know reality is if I can see it, taste it, smell it, touch it, hear it. And that's the end of the day, the reality I can live in relation to.
Yeah, Henry, I'd love to do this sometime on podcasts where we do specific themes, because that's two of Marshall's main things was sense ratio shifting. When you invent a book, you shift it to an eye experience. And when you invent a radio, it becomes an ear experience. And the other one is effects precede causes. The poets, the Mallarmé and the symbolists, and then the rock poets. It doesn't really matter what I say. It's how I want to make you feel. They got it from Poe, who invented the detective novel, reasoning backwards. I'm just going to give you so much and let you fill in some. So
so I'm thinking my alien analogy comes from Octavia Butler's Exogenesis series, where we have trading genes with an alien species changes what humans are and changes their perceptions. We know that different animals, whether it's a dolphin or a dog, see with different spectrums than we do. And therefore, they are having access to different parts of reality than we can get access to. So I can imagine some new species entering our planet who sees reality, experiences it in a profoundly different way. And maybe we could trade genes or learn from it. And I would be all up for that. And imagine the art that would emerge from that trading of genes, right? It'd be a really exciting transformation of human perception. And so media do something like that. They make sounds that we couldn't hear before, but they amplify them. They allow us to hear it. They allow us to see further into the galaxy than we could see before. That's what's one of the things that excites me about media. And in that sense, totally on board with McLuhan on shifting sense ratios being an important part of media.
And then T.S. Eliot said poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in? You sort of touched on that. You called it interior.
Yeah,
Earlier.
interior monologue. I mean, I think through jokes a lot of the time, and maybe this goes back to being raised by a clown, but I have to play with words and sounds and images just and look at every funny possibility, every bad pun that I can generate. And my students see me do that all the time as I'm thinking, I'm making and teaching, I'm making bad puns. And it's just my mind processing something, looking at it at every angle and coming out. So maybe I think through jokes is not far from the truth. I think jokes are a powerful tool for thought.
Amazing. What's one major element, just briefly, of your creative exploration here that's changed since you started, and one major element that stayed the same?
What has changed? I mean, as a writer, uh, I the difference between a typewriter and a computer changed fundamentally how I write, right? Because of the ability to move blocks of text around and to recombine things and so forth, really profound. That I wrote my undergraduate thesis, and it was 300-page long thesis, and my mentor looked at it and said, the period has to go inside the punctuation marks, not outside. Right? And it's like I had no way to correct it. And so this thesis I'd written just sat in my shelf, one copy, and no one ever read it. So, and now that's like one block change on the word processor could fix that problem systematically across the entire document, right? So the way in which the computer works changes what it is to
Yeah.
write. And so the ability to come in and move a block of text from here to there, or say, I really need to elaborate on this and fill in information there, it's so different from writing out longhand and then typing it, as I did in the first phases of my career before we had the ability to have text in a more fluid way. So I would say that's the change in my thinking, and that has huge ripple effects around how you think about writing and even what ideas you think about and how you bring ideas in relation to each other. Now, what's remained the same? That's a harder one to answer, I think, because that changed so much. But one of the things I did from the very beginning is I read my words aloud when I wrote something. And I got to the place where my writing was conversational, or at least conversation with me. And I admit that ideas scamper in odd directions when in a conversation like this one. But the ability to create words, and people say they hear my voice when they read my writing. And it grew out of that idea, the goal of making my writing as oral as I possibly could. And reading my words aloud is still a practice that I engage with from time to time when I'm working with something that's not gelling. And I tell my students that when you read your words aloud, you trip over phrases that are not good writing. You feel in your muscle memory something that when the phrase dangles off, when the participles aren't aligned and so forth, it doesn't work. When the language doesn't pop, when you read it out loud, there's something wrong with it. When you lose your own way in the sentence and don't know where to emphasize things, it's bad writing, and you've got to go back and smooth that out. And so it's a practice I use myself, and it's a practice I teach to my students. They're reading aloud to create a more conversational style of writing and a more fluid style of writing.
Yeah, Joyce insisted that you have to read Finnegan's Wake out loud with a group of people. Have you ever done that?
I haven't done Finnegan's Wake. I've been at Reed's of Moby Dick, and Melville had much a similar
Out loud,
idea.
yeah. We
reading
do
out
that
loud.
we do that in Venice every year for 2 days. They read it on the beach. So yeah, it's interesting because Marshall said he got everything he knows from Finnegan's Wake, basically, or Joyce, and he said Finnegan's Wake's the greatest guidebook to media studies ever. But that whole media ecology academic movement sort of poo-poos. There's very few that really get Finnegan's Wake. As you know, we say Finnegan's Wake invented podcasting, Zoom, and TikTok, and then disguised it as a book. But I'm curious. Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength. Rather, we're taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
Well, I think I probably suffer from what Octavia Butler talked about, hyper empathy. You know, and managing those the sense of feeling a bit overpowered by the emotions of others was something that I learned through my adolescence to begin to manage. And I think hyperempathy deployed as an analytic means I'm very sensitive and aware of other people's thoughts, feelings. I can put them into context. I can do ethnographic work and understand what's driving their thinking. I can walk into a classroom and have a pretty intuitive feel of what everyone in the room is thinking and feeling, to the point that I can turn to a student and I see the thought in their face and say, "You look like you're about to say something," and the students seem startled by the fact that I can perceive that they were about to say something. It's no great, I don't have telepathy or anything. It's just I'm attentive enough to other people's bodies and feelings that I can generally know what they're thinking and feeling. Now, this is very hard to do on Zoom. Zoom's horrible for this sort of stuff, and I feel like my best skills as a teacher have been put out to pasture for the last 2 years, and I've had more conflicts with students and so forth in the last 2 years because that skill set has been blunted by dealing with postage stamp visions of people, or by people whose face is right snap right into yours, because in a ways that's uncomfortably close by the body language conventions of the US, right? That suddenly people's face are shoved into yours. Either way, Zoom is a very uncomfortable environment for someone that has hyper empathy.
That is amazing, because I'm one who's put on events for 40 years with people in a room talking issues. And for 2 years, I've found all my Zoom events are better than my 38, 40 years before that, because I find people are more attentive. I can read their body language and say, "Oh, did you want to say something?" And it's very interesting because I need that full range. I have a bias. I want my events to open up and be in a room together with people live, but it's like I may never return to that, especially the reading clubs we do. It's amazing. We're reading Ulysses, Carl Jung, Finnegan's Wake with people in Dublin and Texas, and they've become my best friends through Zoom. And I don't know their full body shapes even. I know their faces. So it's great to hear what you just said to me. It helps me a lot because I want to suss that out.
I mean, I think that the challenge right now is the alternative is I can see the bottom, only the top part of their face, right? So if I enter a physical classroom where students are wearing masks, it's even worse right now because I can't see anything that's going on in their mouth, and that's really cuts off a lot of the cues that I would rely on in that way. And there's so many other ways Zoom is a godsend, right? The number of talks I've been making all over the world in the last 2 years from places that could never afford to fly me in.
Right.
That's a huge thing that I want to hold on to. The ability to open my events up to people everywhere. That's enormously appealing. So this is not anti-Zoom, but in this particular way, I find Zoom, it's harder for me to do the kind of intuitive, empathetic reading of people's faces that I would do normally. And some of it is my old guy vision, right? My eyesight's getting worse. So it's the details become too small for me to focus on.
Totally get it. And you know this whole thing Marshall said, understanding is not having a point of view. It's knowing the services and disservices. Doesn't mean you can't have a bias and feel one way or the other. But I'm curious your thing about this. You create what you resist, or one creates what one resists. Bob Goldthwait, the comedian, morphed it into "you are what you hate." Joyce said, "It's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you believe. And Louis Buñuel nailed it. He said, "Thank God I'm an atheist." So, Henry, what's your take on what you resist persists, or you create what you resist?
Well, one of the first courses I took in graduate school, the instructor said you should always write about the things that you hate because that's the only way to get objective distance from them. And I thought, what a bizarre way of thinking about the world, because hate is not objective, right? Hate is a passionate engagement. You are implicated in everything you hate. Bourdieu says that the only way to defend taste is through opposition to other people's taste, right? So taste and anti-taste go hand in hand. In our field, people talk about fans and anti-fans, and anti-fans may be as passionate in their commitment to hate watching, to ridiculing, to trying to shut down a form of expression as the fan is to keeping it alive and engaging with it. So that tension is always there, and we are shaped by what we hate. It's precisely that reason that I choose not to hate most of the time, right?
Yeah.
I don't like having enemies. I don't like being in a hateful relationship. I'd rather turn an enemy into a friend that I can learn from than an animosity that's grounded in hate that can be blinding and shut me off from things. I don't want to carry things I hate around with me. So I want to learn how to care about and how to value things that maybe I don't understand on first brush. John Fiske, who was my mentor, said that humans don't engage in meaningless activity. So that I may not understand the meaning of an activity, but it is my obligation as a scholar to dig deep enough to understand what motivates it. And once I do that, then I can get meaning from it too. And so I measure cultural sophistication and how many things can you love and teach other people how to love, rather than how many things you find distasteful and hate and dismiss. So yes, hate touches us, and therefore, if you can minimize hate, you gain more knowledge and more power in the world.
Really well put. One name to spell, please. The person who talked about taste, Bordeaux.
Yeah, it's Bourdieu, I think, and it's Pierre. He's a French
Pierre. Okay,
sociologist. He wrote
great.
a book called Distinction, and
Yeah.
it's a very complex book, but it's full of ideas about taste and how taste operates that I always find generative, even if I don't fully agree with them.
Yeah. Anger can be a productive emotion when fill in the blank.
Well, when it motivates you to speak out on behalf of a wrong, right? When it motivates you to construct something better and replace the thing that makes you angry. But if anger becomes blinding, then I don't think it has that effect. So it's got to be channeled quickly to me into some sort of generative relationship. And it often requires taking the time out from the anger enough to understand why the other person is doing that thing that makes you angry. You've got to suspend the anger long enough to understand. And then if you do feel an injustice is being done, you have to speak out against it.
Henry, how do you find peace of mind?
Um, I was going to say it's right after a piece of something else. I was going to make a bad pun, but I can't get to it quickly enough. But
Back to
no,
the
yes, it's on the shelf, on the P shelf on my bookcase. And no, I mean, I think it's losing myself into something and losing myself into writing, losing myself on a beautiful day walking in the woods, losing myself in a piece of art that speaks to me in some way, you know. And sometimes it's losing myself just as I'm laying in bed at night and breathing consciously, you know, breathing in and out until I'm calmed down enough that I can go to sleep. But all of those are tools of basically losing yourself. It's getting into the flow, to use Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow as that moment as a gamer where or a sportsman where you're playing and your body is thinking on its own. And I think flow is an incredible state to find. It's hard to get to.
I love your conscious breathing. It's so important and it's really hard And it's not that hard. You can consciously breathe. Can you forget to die?
Well, I don't know. I've been obsessed with death for a long time. And it means that every day I wake up and I want to do as many things as I can in that day to fill my life with experiences, to fill my life with productivity. It's probably why my writing has been, I'm so productive as a writer, is there's a battle against the idea that I wasted a day, that I wasted a piece of my life that I can't reclaim. So yeah, death is an important concept for me, and I don't know that I ever forget that death is somewhere on the horizon.
If you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
It gets, I mean, it's a cliche, but it gets better. My 12-year-old self was not particularly a happy child at that moment. Would have just entered seventh grade. The seventh grade world I lived in was extraordinarily hostile to me and to what I valued, who I was. And I had to survive 5 years to get through that and another 2 or 3 years to recover from that. Uh, but the social skills and empathy that grew during that period of time, it's made it possible for me to do all the things that I've done in my life. I'm not sure it's a trade I'd willfully make. I might settle for less social skills and now for less pain then, but I think I would want to try to communicate that sense of it does indeed get better for you. I don't say it guarantees it's better for every human being, but if I'm talking to myself, my life got better, and it got better in part because I was a better person for things that I experienced, that it's left me with greater concern for people who are on the bottom or on the outside of a community, because I was an outcast for much of that early adolescent time period.
Boy, we're winding down here, Henry. This has been truly enlightening, and I really appreciate it. These are 5 quick Alan Watts questions, just off the top of your head, in a just simple couple few words. Who started it all?
The other guy.
Are we going to make it?
I think so.
Where do we put it?
Where do we put it? Where do we put it? I think we put it on the back burner.
Who's cleaning it up?
Uh, Usually I end up cleaning it up.
Is it serious?
Always at least somewhat serious, but why so serious?
Yeah. Well, that's a question. You're saying why so serious?
Well, right. That's the slogan from one of the Chris Nolan Batman movies. The Joker says, "Why so serious?" And
Oh,
so,
nice.
so I like the Joker's position that yes, of course it's serious, but why so serious? Why can't we also think of it in a different way?
I love it. That's Zappa said, I'm very serious about being not serious. Which way should toilet paper come off the roll, over or under?
Over.
Why?
Cause no, no, I mean it's I don't actually care terribly much, but if you're asking me which way I've always done it, it's that way.
Tell me something good you never had and you never want.
Well, I've never cared much about sports. That's good for a lot of other people, but I never particularly want to be athletic.
Yeah, it's good. Never had it, never wanted. That's good. If you were in a vat of vomit up to your neck and someone threw a bag of shit at your face, what would you do?
Oh, cry a lot. I don't know. That's an interesting image. In Hall Pao Villa, which is in Singapore, which is an amusement park dedicated to the Buddhist conception of hell, there is an image, it shows you various images of the afterlife where people are being punished for their sins. And there is an image of people up to their nose in menstrual blood, which seems a particularly culturally tainted material there. And it's a really interesting that parents take their kids to this theme park And they show them these pictures, including this image of being up to your nose in menstrual blood, and tell them this to give them moral instruction. It's very different from going to Disneyland, I think. So I'm not answering your question at all,
No,
really, but it's,
no,
to me, there's a cultural association there that's kind of rich.
no, it's very rich. And in fact, you did say you'd cry a lot. And that's exactly what Mike Kelly, the great artist, said to that answer was cry. It's
Yeah.
very legitimate. But I got a lot of other fun answers, but that's very, so just a couple more here. Joseph Boyes, great eduprop artist, said, make the secrets productive. Lou Welsh, beat poet and ad man, said, guard the secrets, but constantly reveal them. But it was Thornton Wilder in 28. He said, art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time. And Henry, you've laid your cards on the table for more than 90 minutes. Thank you. I'm not insinuating you haven't already answered this, but what's it really all about for you?
Well, I'm a professor, and I'm a professor by nature, not just by a job title. And the job professor is a dead metaphor. We don't think about what it means. But professing is to make knowledge available, to spread knowledge across the culture. And to me, that's what it's all about. So it is, I mean, any secrets, arcane information I gather, it is for spreading, it is for transmitting, it is for making available to other people. And so I try to answer questions honestly. It's not that I'm going to violate someone's secret in terms of loyalty and trust and all of that, going back to one of your earlier terms, but it is that secrets are there so that I can share them and learn. We can collectively learn from them, but they've got to be my secrets to share if I'm going to share them.
Yeah.
I'm not going to share someone else's secrets. That's up to them to share
Yeah.
their secrets.
Yeah, that was good. Very deep. And I've got two more, but if Clinton wants to jump in, that's welcome. What's the cultural shift you see developing today that has an impact on you?
Well, I think, again, we get back to this problems of democracy that I alluded to earlier, right? That I think that the growing attitude of totalitarianism, the lack of trust in infrastructure, the civic infrastructure of the society. And to me, civics is high school teachers did a bad job on us by telling us civics equals government. Civics to me is about the social bond and social contract I have with other citizens, other members of my society. And so that social bond used to be sacred, maybe not widespread across diversity. And I think the challenge is to open it up to more people of diverse backgrounds. But within a community, there was a sense that we were connected to each other. And yes, we had an election. And yes, we voted this way and you voted that way. But at the end of the day, we were still citizens who were committed together. And we worked toward the common good. And I feel like we've reached a point where everything goes to the base, everything goes to wedge issues, everything goes to continually litigating every piece of legislation that's passed. Will we repeal, this? Will we repeal that? Every election is unsettled. And as a result, the divides in the society grow and grow and grow. And what we need is a civic renewal in our society, which makes democracy possible. You can't have democracy if you can't trust each other and trust each other's values. And if elections can't be held, resolved, and reconciliation takes place. So to me, that's the cultural shift that I feel has the most impact on our lives right now, and mine as much as anyone else, because we've been going out with the Civic Imagination Project and talking to communities across America to try to think about what the future might look like and to bring to the surface our shared aspirations and anxieties and find common ground, which is necessary to rebuild that common ground if you're going to have civic engagement and participation.
So I don't know if Clinton's there. He can join if he wants. My last question, Henry, really fun, and I thank you so much, is what, oh, there's Clinton. What gives you the most optimism?
Well, we've been collecting stories through the what we call the Atlas of the Civic Imagination. We've had 300 stories from people around the world, and we asked them to think about what, from the perspective of someone living in 2060, what happened from the pandemic that benefited their lives. What, we've often, when we do the workshops on world building, people say that before they can imagine real change, they have to imagine the society melted down. And we have assumed that the pandemic represents a social meltdown. When we talk to people around the world, there's a lot of agreement about what a better society should be. It has to be environmentally sustainable, and there has to be mutual respect for people whose experiences differ from your own. There has to be a transfer from a world with two major superpowers to a world where all countries work together toward common ends. There are a whole lot of things that people would agree on as fundamental to the future. And I'm seeing those as sparks coming out of the pandemic, which allows people to have hope, imagine alternatives to the world they're living in, and work to achieve them. And so those small sparks of democratic aspiration from countries around the planet is what gives me hope right now.
Beautiful. Henry, thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Clinton. He'll have a follow-up question here.
Yeah, that was delightful to listen to, guys. Fantastic. I've just got a question because you're. It's kind of funny that you brought up the flow state because a question I've been asking people lately is does information flow? And I mean that in the sense of, is it substantial, or what does it mean that we feel information is substantial when we talk about it flowing?
Well, that's interesting. If we could think about, does information flow the way Csikszentmihalyi thinks the mind flows in a play state? Yeah. That's an interesting way to think about it, right? But to achieve that, we have to receive a degree of consistency, and we have to trust that what we're standing on will stay there. You can play a game of tennis if the tennis court would collapse while the tennis court was collapsing underneath you, right? That would not allow you to achieve a state of flow in Csikszentmihalyi's sense. And right now, information is more like a crumbling tennis court than like a stable foundation we can stand upon and trust. Mm-hmm. And that means that it is not, I don't know that information flows through me or that I achieve a state of flow in response to information. I need to be continually holding on for dear life in a precarious information environment, which requires me to constantly question whether what I'm standing on is stable, whether it's solid and reliable, not something that I can just take for granted and act on. And so that sense of loss of stability affects the ability of us to have an information flow in that sense.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. It makes me think of playing Super Smash Bros. Actually, because that's exactly it. You are playing tennis on a crumbling platform.
Yes.
well, you beat each other. Yeah. It's funny. I wonder if it's got something like, does the way we use media so much, do you think it affects embodiment to the degree that it's changing, or that our senses are constantly being fooled in that regard?
I don't know that we're being fooled. I think most of us are pretty aware of what media is. I think there are occasional stunts where I can, where a 360 cinema screen can create a sense of height. I know I suffer from fear of heights, and I was riding this Disneyland ride with this highly projective screen that I'm soaring out over some landscape, and I developed that twitch, the internal uneasiness that I feel from heights. And when the ride's over, I step down off the platform and, and my feet hit the ground. And my wife just has learned that when I get to that state on a ride, just to put her feet underneath mine if we're sitting next to each other, and I feel some sense of foundation. So in that sense, my body is tricked, right? I have vertigo when I'm only a few feet off the ground. And so media can achieve that. But I think most of the time we're engaging with media, we're aware of the media. Most new media works very hard to intensify our awareness of itself. It's highly self-reflexive, right? Media, games, I think, are highly reflexive. I think podcast drama, say, is constantly telling us we're listening to something that was recorded, even when it's meant to be a fake podcast, which a lot of the podcast dramas use the device of, this is a podcast I'm listening to, but a podcast from a world where something fantastic is taking place in. So I don't think we're fooled by media very often, but I think there are occasions where we can be. And does that affect our embodiment? It's certainly in that moment. That moment I'm feeling vertigo when I'm only a couple of feet off the ground because I have an impression of media that changes my senses.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really powerful thing. And I think I want to understand better what's going on. Or think about a group of people are playing a video game, and behind them is a group of people who are watching them play their video game. It's interesting that the person playing the game moves their body side by side like the character on the screen. What's interesting is the person not playing the game moves their body side by side, watching them move their body side to side. Right? And I've seen that happen again and again and again. So it's not even the experience of the medium directly that leads you to sort of feel like the racing car is swaying or whatever it is that's causing you. You're jumping from, your body jumps up and down as Super Mario jumps from platform to platform. But the people watching the game, there's something about games as a medium that invites that level of visceral participation. And I think that really interests me about our experience of media.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's fascinating. I guess what's the term for that? Is it proprioception or something? I guess. I think I got that from
probably has something to do with mirror neurons, I think, but I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not an expert.
And well, fan culture. You are something of an expert. I was huge into Star Trek fan films when I was a teenager. I was wondering if you ever looked into that subculture, because there's 30-40 classic Star Trek episodes. Well, that's an exaggeration. 20 new classic Star Trek episodes out there that I was following the production of eagerly. 2004, 2005, stuff like that. Yeah, you've written about Star Wars and Harry Potter and the Matrix films and Twin Peaks. I'm just curious if you ever looked into that particular fandom, because it was sort of pioneering.
Well, I have written some stuff about it, and I got involved in a lawsuit around the fan film Axanar.
Oh my God!
Right?
Yeah,
which was
guy ruined. Well, sorry.
Yes, it was a fiasco, right? The guy's a jerk,
Mm-hmm.
and his practices were unethical. But insofar as that film was going to be used as a test case for fan cinema more generally,
Yeah.
I felt some obligation to be an expert witness at that case. It never reached trial, but I was deposed as an expert witness on the Axanar case, which required me going back and tracing Star Trek fan films. So that's not stuff that ever got published because it's part of a legal proceeding, but it is something that I have looked at. And my colleague here, Robert Kuznets, has written a fair amount about Star Trek fan cinema during that period. So he and I, in dialogue, I learned a lot and was interested. Star Trek was my first fandom, so I'm always interested in it. But somehow the Star Wars stuff grabbed my attention when fan cinema was starting a bit more than the Star Trek stuff. But that fusion of the professional and the amateur that Star Trek fan films created, using, Walter Koenig, for example, as an actor in fan films, or you borrowing props and sets, getting DC Fontana to write scripts for fan films. Yeah. That blurring of the lines was really part of what's interesting, but what made this Axanar case particularly vexing, because it was a film so professional in its execution that it seemed to pose a direct threat to Paramount.
Yeah, I think he was fundraising to build the sets. Like he was doing fundraising, right? And no other fan film had solicited funds or would accept the solicitation of
And not just
funds.
soliciting funds, but millions of dollars of funds, which no one knew had oversight over. And so, yeah, he was not a hero for me. I admired the film, but if this was going to be the battleground Paramount shows, then the question of whether it constituted fair use and a reinterpretation, a parody in effect, of Star Trek was a legal question that I think was worth fighting over. It was not my choice of what the test case should be, but it did seem for a while there that it was going to be the test case. And that led me to wanting to be part of that process.
Yeah.
So when they reached out to me about being an expert witness, I said yes, even though I had some complex misgivings about the particulars of the Axanar case.
Sure, that makes sense. I mean, I don't see how it could be a parody when the guy's literally playing Garth of Izar, who's an actual character from an episode, right? So it's not right. It seems
well, parody legally doesn't mean ha ha. It means taking a work and putting another interpretation on top of it. And so the question would be, does Axanar offer an interpretation of battle and war in the Star Trek universe that is different from the one on the show? And does the use of Ken Burns' techniques applied to Star Trek change the way we think about the combatants in that setting? And it's an open question. I would argue it does, and therefore constitutes, in some sense, parody as legally defined. But I don't think it's parody in the sense that it makes fun of Star Trek. I think it's parody in the sense that it makes a critical intervention in Star Trek, which is the ground in which I define most fan films and fan fiction. But it's still this question of confusion, because confusion is a trademark category, not a copyright category. And trademark, anything that blurs the boundaries that might lead to someone confusing it for the official product, is deeply problematic. And that's where the fact that it's so technically well executed, that it's using professional actors, so forth, the likelihood of confusion and the absence of clear signaling makes it a more problematic case. But the fact that it offers an interpretation, I think it arguably does.
That's fascinating. Thanks for asking that. I just wanted to show off my. So James Cawley, who played Captain Kirk on Star Trek Phase 2, he commissioned a whole bunch of original classic Star Trek boots from the Hollywood prop company that made the classic Star Trek boots. But they had to create a bulk order, so they had to buy 300 pairs in order to buy them. So everyone who watched the show had to buy a pair of boots, custom made from the prop company, in order to fulfill the bulk order.
Wow, that's really
So
interesting.
I got classic Star Trek prop boots from the original series. Yeah, so they used William Shatner's boots in order to make them. So it's kind of like, it's just that's probably,
that is cool.
If my house was burning down and I had to save one thing, it'd probably be
could be. Well, one of my claims to fame is that I'm canonically a Klingon. So when J.J. Abrams made the Star Trek reboot film, he reached out to me and asked if I would be an extra on Star Trek. And of course, I said, hell yeah. And I got there and they wanted me to be a Klingon. So I wore this huge, elaborate Klingon outfit, put on the makeup, the whole 9 yards. They didn't let you take any pictures for secrecy reasons, so there are no pictures of me. And if you remember your Star Trek film, there are no Klingons in that movie. So the Klingons ended up getting cut out. But if you look at the DVD extras, they put on a shot of a Klingon in silhouette looking out over an encampment at dusk, and the Klingon in silhouette is me.
Oh,
so there is an argument about whether that's canonical or not, and if it's a DVD extra. It was shot officially for the film, but I like to think of myself as canonically existing as a Klingon in the Star Trek universe.
Kapla.
But I was the world's shortest Klingon, because every other Klingon they had on the set were black basketball players. So I had a Napoleon complex is the way I conceptualized my character.
Yeah.
Really a tiny Klingon.
I'm sure you were all the more fierce for it.
Absolutely.
Hey, Jerry, where'd you go? We're enjoying your garden. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Professor Jenkins, and I'm sure Jerry
Likewise.
returned the same. Yeah. I think this about concludes the interview. But thanks for coming on.
Oh,
the
my
channel.
pleasure. My pleasure. It's a lot of fun.
For sure. You take care.